This is Making Comics 101, Issue 9, Paneling. Greetings, people of the internet. I'm Scott with Serkworks Art Labs. Welcome, mad creators, to the underground laboratory where together we are going to create some awesome comics, because this is Making Comics 101. We're already up to issue 9, almost into the double digits. Today we are going to talk about paneling. Now, if you've just stumbled onto this video and you think we're going to go into like some techniques for installing like wainscoting or aluminum siding, it's not that kind of paneling. We're talking about comic book panels, so that's what we're going to get into. So if you ever wanted to know kind of how to lay out your comic, what are some cool panels to use, some of the great kind of the old standbys and all that, and just some creative ways to lay out your comic, then you are in the right place. All right, so the first thing I want to get into, I want to dive into right off the bat is layout. We're going to talk a little bit about the layout of your panels, the layout of your comics. Panels are what make comics unique onto, and different than pretty much any other medium. There's things you can do in comics that you just can't do in film or in books. Most of that is due to the way we tell our story in panels. The first thing, probably the basic panel grid that most people are familiar with, is this one here. There we go. It's the 9-panel grid. So this is an excellent starting point, and you can tell a complete story just using this 9-panel grid. Now, obviously, you can go crazy and do some different things, but this is a really good starting point, and it also makes for a great comic. You don't want to go wrong. This is a good way to do it. So again, 9-panel grid. It is basically 9 panels. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that it has to stick to this. I mean, we can still use this 9-panel format. Assume that this is just a template and these panels aren't on here, that this is just a grid. When we're laying out our panels, we could go make this, combine these 2 panels, make that a little longer, and then maybe we go down here and combine all 3 of them. It's still that 9-panel grid. You can go up to like 12-panel grids if you want, or whatever. There's some times in my stories where I will do that, and that's all dependent on kind of the pacing, and we'll get into that in a minute. You want to kind of start off with that 9-panel grid system. One thing you want to be careful of when you're working with a grid like this, and this isn't really the case for the 9-panel because it's so basic, most people, they know how to read this. Because everything kind of intersects like here with these T's and things, it can, if it gets a little more complicated, if you get more of these panels like that, it can get a little confusing because you get what we call rivers, where your eye kind of goes this way or not. But one thing, if you want to take it a step, like when you start breaking these up, when I was talking about combining 2 or whatever panels, when you start doing that, one of the things you want to think about is a layout sort of like this. It's staggering. So you stagger your panels so you can kind of see, we don't, if I would have had this layout here and then flip this around where this goes like this, where there's 2 like that can get a little confusing. That can kind of create a river and your eye doesn't know exactly where to go. So when you kind of stagger, you can kind of see where this breaks down here. This doesn't continue. It kind of stops and then it starts over here. So especially, all it would take is just move this over a little bit here, so we can eliminate some of those rivers. So it's something to think about. Although, again, that doesn't seem to be a problem with this 9-panel grid. When talking about layout, one of the most important things, the thing we always want to be thinking about, and this goes into not just the panels, but once we start getting into, adding the elements in our stories, the figures and the surroundings and the backgrounds and all that kind of stuff, we want to think about composition, and we want to think about this. We want to talk about the rule of thirds. So you can kind of see, now these are not panels, like you could say that's a 9-panel grid. Just imagine this as one full panel, all right? So we've broken this down into thirds. Now this is a technique that's used in photography, it's used in film. When you're laying your elements into, this would be one full panel, just think, and you don't have to draw this out, you can kind of cheat it and figure it out in your mind, but break everything up into these 3 things. Typically, you don't want to have your focal point, which is whatever's the main, the most interesting, the thing you want to draw the reader's attention to. You don't want to have it just dead set in the center. It just doesn't look, it's too, you want to go with something a little more asymmetrical. So if we have a character in here, we want to have them kind of line up on maybe either side of this line here and not directly in the middle. Now, there's exceptions to every rule. If I have a character and I want it to be like he's shocked and we're zooming in and maybe it's a extreme close-up, then then maybe this person's in the center, maybe we've got speed lines going in, that kind of thing can work. But more or less, you get more interesting composition if you were to lay characters out on either one of these intersecting lines and not directly in the center. And that distance doesn't go for characters, that goes for like buildings or whatever, or anything interesting you want to put in here. You don't want to have it right smack dab in the middle. Now if you've got two characters talking, you've got a character over here, try to kind of line, you can also line them up on that line. So just be thinking about the rule of thirds when we're laying out our panels. Now, some interesting things to consider when we're doing our panels is there's rules we can break. Not everything has to, when we lay out our panels, we put things in, everything doesn't have to fit in the panels. It's not like, it's like that creative expression, think outside the box. It goes the same for panels. So, and this is something you want to use sparingly. You don't want to use it all the time or it loses effect, but you can always break your panels. For instance, here's a page from Young and the Dead. Well, here, I'll show you. This is the original, it's a little bigger, and then I'll show you the. So right here, you can see our character. You see a scene right here with our character swinging this like a wooden hammer, almost like a Thor's hammer, but it's a wooden hammer. And see how it breaks through the panel, and that really gives it some impact. If it was stayed in there, it just wouldn't have that same effect. Now, if I did this all over the place, again, it's going to lose that effect. Here, I'll show you kind of the final page. And this has got the sound effects and everything on there, but see how dynamic that is. And the other thing is we don't even have to always have panels. Like right here, if you move down to this character Lloyd, there's no panel there. He's just kind of sitting there. So, and again, if we did all our panels like that, it would get very confusing because it's like, what's going on here? These characters are all over the place. We do need panels, but we can break that format every now and then. Break out of the panels or just eliminate the panels. And I don't know, this is a technique. A lot of this stuff I haven't even really stopped to think of the reasoning behind it. But when you read comics and you see things and you're like, oh, that's interesting, that works, and it just starts to inform you and you start to pick some of this stuff up. So the absence of a panel, it just creates a nice effect. The way I'm looking at it is this is this character's first appearance. So because of that, it's a little different. It's important. It's something that's a little, it separates it from everything else on there. Sometimes this can be things that are in your subconscious that you're not even thinking about. I guess one reason why we might have like the absence of a panel is because we're dealing with negative space. And if you know anything about graphic design, negative space is super important. And not just graphic design, but it goes under other mediums. But so we're not just paying attention to the panels itself, what's in the panels. We also want to pay attention what's in here, in between the panels. And these are called gutters. If we want to space things out, maybe we make the gutters a little longer. Again, maybe we can just eliminate that altogether and make a giant, I guess that would be like a giant gutter space. It's not just what's in the panel, it's also the negative space. And that's why I think breaking those panels and the absence of panels can really help with your storytelling. All right, we've touched on like the 9-panel grid, and like I said, you can go up to 12 panels. You can do any number of panels. The number of panels you do can say different things. We'll get into some of that a little more. Even just one panel, I mean, that's basically what we would call a splash page. So I want to show you here and show you how effective it is. This is Infinity Gauntlet. This is the trade. So we've got this giant explosion. Now we could have done that in a small panel here or even like this, but we want this to be big. This is so important in our story that we want to take up the whole page with just this image. I mean, and you can see, I mean, we're dealing with these smaller panels. As you see, as we're building this up, these are very tiny, small panels, and then boom, right here in your face, this giant explosion. I mean, it just says so much. So in some cases, one panel as a splash page works really well. Now, some people, again, there's no hard and fast rules. There's people who have told comic book stories with just a whole story in splash pages. Here's another, even bigger than that. In addition to the splash page, we can do spreads. Now, I've got, I don't know if I have it here. This is part of it. I did a whole story, the story I did for the comic, or the 100 Days comic anthology. This is just one half of it, so you can't see it, so it's probably not the best example. But this actually is there's another part that goes over here. I think I showed it in the last proper issue when we were talking about thumbnails. So this is actually part of a spread. So I've done comics where I've told the whole thing as a spread instead of just going through, you know, individual pages. Imagine another page out here and the whole story would kind of go this way across both spreads. You don't even have to do panels if you're telling a story using a spread like this. Here again, that's even bigger than like the explosion. We've got a double page spread splash page. This is from, I think, Wildcats. I like going back to the old 90s stuff because it is just, they went nuts with panels and stuff, almost to a detriment. But in this case, you've got Jim Lee's characters facing up with the Liefelds. It's kind of a crossover thing, Youngblood and Wildcats. So because of this, they wanted, Jim Lee wanted this to be something like in your face. So it crosses both things. We've got all the different characters matching up, and this is very cinematic. So, you know, that's kind of how we're used to, when we think cinema, we think big and bold and everything like that. Again, I want to remind you that we can do things in comics we can't necessarily do in film, so we want to take advantage of that. But every once in a while, it's nice to get a big, a big double page kind of cinematic spread in there. Now, we talked a little bit about layout, and now I want to get into storytelling, because as I keep kind of harping on this, but with panels, there's so many cool things we can do, but we have to understand how stories are told or how to tell story in a comic book form. Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics goes into this in depth on how people read comics and everything, and that's, like I said, way more in depth than I'm going to go into now. So definitely check that out. As far as the basics go, we need to understand that in the Western world, comic books are pretty much read from left to right in sort of a zigzag formation. So we know we're going to go here, then we're going to go down here, then over here, then down here, then over here, and then back down again. Japanese, like manga, would be sort of the opposite. We're kind of just going under the American style of telling stories, or here in the Western world. So left to right, zigzag formation. Sometimes, we can do tricky things, but we got to keep that in mind, and that comes down to kind of some of the stuff that we're putting in our panels. For instance, a lot of it has to do with help guiding the reader, and there's a lot of ways you can do that. That panel that I showed before, this one right here, not only are we breaking that panel, there's some thought put into this. So we've got this going on, we broke the panel, we showed that impact, it's coming through, it's super important, but you see where these lines, see all that action? We're looking here, and then boom, right here, this thing goes right back into this panel. So I'm guiding the reader's eye to exactly where I want it. Now, even if this wasn't here, like I said, naturally, this is the way we read comics. But this helps even more, it kind of goes down here and then right to this subject. Now, the other thing, it's not just things like that. That's almost like an arrow. It's pretty obvious if you look at it that I'm guiding your eye there. But there's other things that we might not even pick up right away, and that's just the eye line of our characters, where our characters are facing. We've got, if I flip this around, it's not going to have the same impact because the character is going to be looking off here. So instead of, here we're looking here, this character's looking back here, this character's, her eyes, even though she's facing this direction, her eyes are looking over here, back to this panel. Again, he's kind of looking up, going again to her, then this is kind of a stop right here where this door slams. But again, we've got our character down here, he's looking at this character, he's got a kind of expression in his face, and again, looking off, going out. We're leading the reader's eyes throughout this panel. So I could have, had flipped him around, which would just lead it back here. Not to say that you couldn't do that in some situations, because you do want to switch things up a little bit. You don't always want to have everyone looking the same way. But be very careful about, where your characters are looking, and where objects are pointed, and all that kind of stuff, because that's going to inform the way the reader kind of goes through your comic and everything. Unless you're used to reading comics, it can become it's hard for people to just jump in comics because they're like, how do I read this? So you want to make it as easy as possible for the reader. Now you can get tricky and do some fun things along the way as well, but those are some good basics, some good, good foundation to think about when you're laying out your panel. Comic book artists, myself included, we get a lot of our inspiration from film because we watch a lot of TV, we watch a lot of entertainment, so we see that, and there's a lot you can gather from that, but you can always take it a step further with panels. As I just mentioned, we are able to kind of guide where our story is going, whereas in a film, you're just kind of along for the ride. You can't pace yourself. I mean, if you just check out, I mean, it's on to the next scene in a movie. But with comics, we can control the pacing of our story using the number of panels, the shape of our panel, all that stuff comes into play. So we can if we want to slow our reader down, we can do that. For instance, you know, if we got, like we showed before, with the giant splash page, boom, that's it. It's there, and then we're kind of on to the next thing. And as I showed that kind of lead up to that panel, it kind of it builds slowly, and then boom, like that. So that's things we can consider. Now, if we want super exciting action, we want to use probably less panels. In a situation like this is part of my story, Young and the Dead. I just want to kind of show him kind of hanging out. Maybe he's bored, maybe he's just entertaining himself. You can see he's yawning. So there's not a lot of action going on, but that's kind of what I'm showing. I'm trying to slow the pace down. So you've got a number of panels here with just little itty bitty, you know, different things going on. And each one of these is a different activity that would probably, you know, you could, if it was real life, it would take longer. So it's almost like a montage. But you can do this kind of stuff in one page. I can show without doing a whole comic. When you have a movie, if you want to show that passage of time, it's a little harder unless you just make a long drawn out scene. But here in one page, I can show that, yeah, he's just occupying his time, you know, everything like that. Same thing with a similar panel. So here's a scene, and with this scene, I wanted to show, again, sort of like boredom or whatever. People are just sitting here eating. Now, we got one panel up here, but then down below, it's basically, you know, this is what we've got, like a 12 panel here, is it? Yeah, 4, 8, 12. So anyway, but yeah, so just little things going on, like scraping, looking around, like everyone's kind of annoyed, different people like slurping. So it's just kind of I've slowed things down. I'm showing they're just sitting here eating dinner, not a lot's going on. But then later on in the story, I pick up the pace when we start introducing zombies and everything, and there's more action. That's the great thing about comics, is that you can speed the action up, you can slow things down, and that's all done with like the size of panels, number of panels, things like that. So you might be saying, Scott, that's great, but you know, I know a lot, but where do I start off with? Is there a certain panel to start off with? If you're creating a new scene, you always want to let the reader kind of know where they are, unless, and I mentioned this before, unless you're purposely trying to throw people off. But usually the first scene you want to do an establishing shot. So like, for instance, here, we're moving it, this is Young and the Dead number 4. I've got an establishing shot here of this building. This is sort of the research facility. So we're here looking at this building. We've got sort of a wide shot so we can kind of see where we are, and then we can start zooming in. We want to think about like the establishing shots just to let people know where they are. And usually an establishing shot, a lot of times it's just like a rectangular shot like this, or it could be a full page. We could show exactly where we could see a character like kind of walking through a busy cityscape or whatever, or like a skyline. You know, maybe it's Batman, maybe it's got a skyline, maybe it's got the bat symbol up here or whatever. But that will let the reader know exactly where they are in the story. So, you know, usually a rectangular panel or something like that is a good starting point to kind of get characters into the story. And when you're creating your story, when you're laying out your panels, pay attention to like camera angles. Now, granted, this isn't cinema, this is comics, but we do want to sort of think like a cinematographer as far as the eyes of the reader as the camera, what we want to focus on and everything, and we want to keep it interesting. So we don't want to have just a bunch of talking heads. That can get a little boring. We want to switch things up. Like, so when we're laying things out, we want to have like maybe some close-up shots, maybe some bird's eye view or some worm's eye view, or we've got like basically torso up views, or you know, all that kind of stuff. But we don't, even if we're doing an action scene, if we got every scene where we see the character in a full like fighting stance, that's going to get a little boring. We want to go, maybe we'll have him jumping up, and then we want to zoom in on his face, extreme close-up, things like that. So pay attention to you know, what's in your panels as well. You don't want to just repeat the same things over and over again, or only do one thing. You want to switch it up. You want this to be interesting, and different views, different angles, all that kind of stuff, you know, comes into play. And again, pay attention to where the character's eyes are and things that we talked about before, so we're not throwing the reader, you know, off. So we're kind of guiding them around. But we'll switch up the size of the panels, the angles, all that kind of stuff. And you know, back to the rule of thirds, we want each panel to have whatever that focal point in that panel. We want the reader's eye to be drawn to that. Think about the focal point. You know, think about foreground, middle ground. We'll get. I guess we might get into this a little more when we're doing either like sketching or penciling and things like that. But you know, foreshortening, all that kind of stuff. And again, that can kind of, if you got a character punching, maybe the top. See how my fist goes off the screen? Well, maybe in a comic, we're not limited to that screen. We can break those panels. That's another great thing about comics and with these panels is we can break out of these panels, and you can't unless it's a 3D movie maybe, but it's still, you know, you're still confined to that you know, the ratio of the screen when you're talking about cinema. In panels, we don't have to worry about that. We can do so many interesting things, and I can go on and on about all of the really cool stuff that we can do, and that would be cool. Maybe in a bonus exercise we do, I don't know. That's what makes comics so great. The use of panels just allow us to do so much interesting storytelling. And you also have to know what to put in the panels. You need to know what to show and what not to show. For instance, you know, you've got a character punching. You don't want to have every panel going like this. You can start up with like the wind up, and then before you know it, the guy's knocked out like that. We can read in between. We don't have to show all that stuff. So we want to know what to show in our panels. We want to pick the important moments in our story, because the reader is going to fill in all the blanks. So if it's not interesting, you know, if it's something that can be inferred between this panel and that panel, we don't want to include any of that stuff. You know, we want to keep that pacing going, everything, and not have any extraneous detail in our story. Now, when I say know what to show and what not to show, sometimes detail is a thing. Like if we're trying to show like texture and all that stuff, or whatever it is in the story, we can show a lot of detail, but sometimes the absence of the detail is just as effective. For instance, we could throw in a silhouette, like I mentioned before, just that image of Batman across Gotham City with that bat symbol behind him. Just a silhouette says so much. So, I mean, in some ways, I mean, some people might think it's cheating because you don't have to fill in all the details, but really, every once in a while, you got a character off in the distance, you could just put them in silhouette, maybe two characters kind of talking like this. You don't really need to know what's going on. You can see they're out there, maybe the rain's coming down and everything, but they're off in the distance. You can use silhouettes. There's just so many ways to fill our panels and just create interesting environment in our stories. And we can go a little crazy with our panel. We can do things that normally you don't see in other comics, but you want to keep it consistent throughout whatever comic you're doing. For instance, so this is a comic book that I started a long time ago. This is like one of my first comics. It's called Retrofits, and it takes place in the 70s. It's a lot of disco type stuff. I'll kind of show you, as you can kind of see from this image, you know, just the clothing and the hairstyles and everything like that, and even this typography here, very 60s, early 70s, all that kind of stuff. But you'll notice in the panel what I did was, it's very decorative. I wanted to have a lot of like graphic design. So it's not just your standard panel. I mean, it kind of falls with that sort of 70s vibe with the rounded corners, and see how things, you know, I don't know if you can see that, how these graphic elements go throughout. I really wanted to create this unique look with this. Again, here, you can kind of see this graphic element, how it kind of drops down. And so with this, I just wanted to do something interesting with the panel layout. So that's something you can think about depending on what your story is. Or you can keep it basic. Basic is always a good way to go. You don't want to go too crazy with stuff like that, or you might get in trouble. Now, another thing as far as style goes, with Young and the Dead, for instance, I showed this panel, or this page. There's not a whole lot going on. These are your basic panels. Now, like I said, my story is sort of a zombie story. So I want to show you, this is kind of when the zombies start to attack. When the action starts to happen in my comic, things kind of change. See how this panel is askew, and right here, see how the panels are kind of tilted and kind of haphazard and everything? That's intentional. I want, when I've got an action scene going on with zombies attacking and everything, I want you to feel disoriented. I want you to feel like like everything's kind of moving around and fast paced. So normally I wouldn't do this. If it's just two characters talking, I'm not going to use this technique with these tilted panels and everything, because it doesn't work like that. So again, here's another scene where we've got some action going on. We've got panels going over other panels. And it's just like this one, boom, 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 and then behind it we've got sort of the spread, and then down here we've got more stuff. Now this could get a little confusing, but that's also the look I'm going for. I want the reader to be kind of confused in this because there's a lot going on. I want them to be placed in the situation that these kids are in. They're sitting here and these zombies are starting to attack. Well, you know, there's one over here, there's one over here, what's going on? So that's why I purposely created that layout to be very off kilter and all over the place and very confusing, because I want to put you in that situation. So style is something that there's so much you can do, but you got to use it sparingly, use it in the right moments, use it in the right project, like the retrofits thing. Again, that kind of style format isn't going to work in sort of a more of a modern type thing, and it's experimental, and maybe I pulled that off, maybe I didn't, I don't know. But it's fun to kind of experiment, try different things out with the style of your panels, and, you know, just have fun with it. Like I mentioned, there's so much more we can go into with panels. I'm not going to do that, but I do want to give you tell you about a YouTube channel if you're not familiar with. It's called Strip Panel Naked. So if I can remember, I'll put the link in the description. If I forget, just go to Strip Panel Naked on YouTube. The host basically picks out comic books and he goes through a lot of it, just the storytelling and why different writers and artists chose to use panels the way they did. It's just a great channel, and you're going to learn so much, and there's tons of content on there. So I would go definitely check out that channel if you want to dive a little more deeper into panels. But as far as panels go, like I said, I can go on, but I think that'll give us the basics, and you know, we'll do some other stuff as far as bonus issues and maybe quick tips and everything with as far as panels go. But for right now, that's going to do it for this week's episode of Making Comics 101, all about panels. If you got any questions about panels, if you come up with some interesting techniques for panels, I want to know. Let me know in the comment section, and I will see you guys later. That is all. Hey, thanks for watching. If you like what you saw and you want to see more, hit that subscribe button. Also, you can follow me at Serkworks on social media, and now you can support the work that I do on Patreon. Do you like making comics? Then go to Serkworks.com and pick up the Comic Maker Starter Kit. It's packed full of fonts, brushes, templates, and more. And best of all, it's totally free.